Let's get started though, because we have a lot to cover today. So for next time, we're going to get into Proust. And the main reading for next week is Benjamin's essay on Proust. But we also have Bergson, which we will discuss. So we have selections from Matter and Memory, which is potentially a difficult read because it's a philosophical text. And then we also, I'm encouraging you guys to at least dip into Proust's actual writing, Swann's Way, the first chapter and the last chapter of this first volume of In Search of Lost Time or Remembrance of Things Past. But the main reading is The Image of Proust. So, volunteers for next time. Proustian. Okay, Rose. Okay. Who else? Okay, Matthias, great. Okay. And then today our readings are going to be concerned, our discussion is going to be concerned with Kant and Freud. So a kind of a background for Benjamin, kind of pre-Marxist Benjamin. That's what we're reading. So we didn't get to his experience essay from 1913. We're going to look at that now, which will also give us the Nietzschean Benjamin. And then we have the Program of the Coming Philosophy, which is the Kantian Benjamin. And then we'll get into Freud as well. So Kant and Freud as background. Now, what I'd say about Benjamin is that he's part of a kind of general culture and kind of academic milieu that is dominated by neo-Kantianism. So end of the 1800s, early 1900s, neo-Kantianism. Freud is a little bit more avant-garde at this point. So we're really talking about pre-World War I situation. And neo-Kantianism is a little bit struggling with Kant, really struggling with Hegel, struggling against Hegel. That's part of the neo-Kantianism. And then there's also neo-Hegelianism in the mix that follows from neo-Kantianism. But really the question is that we're going to see, what's the changed status of Kant after the 19th century? So if we're going to start dealing with this history pretty quickly next week with Proust, but I want to at least sort of sketch it. Since the Arcades project that we'll be reading from Benjamin is really his 19th century history, looking back from the 20th century. Okay, so Kant is a figure from before the French Revolution. We use the French Revolution and also the American Revolution as kind of part of this late 18th century revolutionary moment. Kant is in the era of the American Revolution, not yet the French Revolution. And we can talk about the Enlightenment as culminating with Kant, or maybe coming to an end with Kant, depending on how you look at it. So the 1700s, basically, there are two phases of the Enlightenment. The 17th and the 18th century, so the 1600s and the 1700s. And then there's a kind of a crisis with respect to this. And associated with Hegel in philosophy Hegel described his moment as romantic. Right, so there's another way of looking at this, which is that Enlightenment has a kind of classicism, and then that crisis around the French Revolution is the emergence of Romanticism. Associated with Hegel. And Hegel's controversial in terms of if he's a continuation of the Enlightenment or some kind of betrayal of the Enlightenment. Now, I should also say there's Enlightenment, there's also counter-Enlightenment. And counter-Enlightenment is not really equivalent to Romanticism, but there's some overlap between Romanticism and the counter-Enlightenment. All right. Again, this is history that we're going to cover repeatedly throughout the course. I'm just sort of plotting everything out. So I mentioned the Enlightenment, 1600s, 1700s. Going back a further century, to the 1500s, the 16th century, you have the emergence of bourgeois society, post-Renaissance, bourgeois society. But then you have this other phenomenon that's really bringing us into the 19th century, and that is the Industrial Revolution, or what Marxism called capitalism. So there are different ways of describing capitalism, but the term is really a 19th century term, and with Marxism we're going to see that it's defined by the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution as a crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society. Very important. All right, so we have the American and French Revolutions. The Napoleonic Wars, so the whole cycle bringing us to 1815. We have the Restoration. We have the July Revolution, which is 1830. That's the revolutions that is depicted by Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. Do you know this painting? Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix. And then the 1830s to 1840s is a crucial cycle. It's a boom-bust cycle of industrial capitalism. And the 1840s are known as the Hungry 40s because it's the first global depression after the Industrial Revolution. And that's the decade that Marx and Engels came to consciousness. They're in their 20s in the 1840s. And the 1830s and 40s is also the era of Hegelianism, but also the crisis of Hegelianism. So Marx and Engels were young Hegelians, but they're on the younger end of the young Hegelian spectrum, meaning they didn't actually study with Hegel. Other of the young Hegelians did. They're too young to have studied with Hegel. And the hungry 1840s, the crisis of really capitalism per se, then culminates in the revolutions of 1848, which are known as the Spring of the Nations, or the Spring of the Peoples. That's where we get the term spring, like Arab Spring. That's where we get that concept from. Like when there's a wave of revolutions, they call it the spring, right? So there was a Prague Spring, 1968. I'm trying to think of other examples where they've used that. Yeah, Arab Spring, Prague Spring, those are the ones that come to mind. But the revolutions of 1848, in which Marx and Engels participated, and they wrote the Communist Manifesto right before those revolutions broke out, because it was clear that a revolution was going to break out. We will also see that 1848 is the Baudelaire moment.
What were the revolutions?
They were in France and Germany, also Austria, and throughout Europe, really, but those are the main ones. So Marx and Engels participated in the French and German revolutions of 1848. The French Revolution of 1848, in France, it brings about, we'll be talking about this, the Second Republic, right? Because the First Republic is during the First Revolution. But then the Second Republic, like the First Republic became the Empire. The Second Republic became the Second Empire. And it's Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, who is elected president in the Second Republic and then declares the Second Empire and rules until he's deposed on the battlefield during the Franco-Prussian War. So he rules for 20 more years. He's elected in 1848. Deposed during the Franco-Prussian War, and also there's the Paris Commune at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which is the uprising of the citizens of Paris against the surrender of Paris to the Germans, because Germany occupies France. They defeat the French, they occupy France. They crown is it Wilhelm I, Emperor of Germany, at Versailles, as a national humiliation of the French. So, anyway, we're going to talk about this because the Second Empire is very important for Benjamin in the Arcades Project. We'll be reading his long essay on Baudelaire, Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. But where we are today is in this later period, post Franco-Prussian War, and Franco-Prussian War was foundational and formative for Nietzsche, who serves as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War, but gets sick and is cashed out, and he has a strong reaction to like German triumphalism, German militarism, German nationalism. Very strong reaction against that. Ironically, because then he's taken up later by German nationalists, right? But he's actually very kind of anti-German in that way. He says he wants to be a good European. He's proud of his Polish heritage, so he's not a purebred German, because that would be awful. He thinks, anyway. And Nietzsche is also influenced by Baudelaire. A great deal. But anyway, we're in this later period between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, and the revolutions that follow World War I. We're in this period, the Second Industrial Revolution, also known as the Belle Epoque in France, so it's Third Republic France. Also known as the Gilded Age in the Anglophone world, in the United States, but also in Britain, the Gilded Age. So, Second Industrial Revolution, First Industrial Revolution, let's talk about that. First Industrial Revolution is firstly Britain, England, but then, so in the early phase, it's England. After the French Revolution, it's also France, and it's also the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands. Second Industrial Revolution is, well, it's Germany, but it's the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Russia. And of course, the rise of the United States, Germany, and Japan lead us to happy times in the 20th century, World War I and World War II. Right. And the industrial, and Italy, of course, fascism and where fascism was invented. Russia, rapid industrialization in this period of the Second Industrial Revolution. The losers of World War I have revolutions. The losers of World War I have revolutions. So Russia loses, but then the Central Powers also lose. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And so there's the Turkish nationalist revolution, Ataturk. There's the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's also a brief socialist uprising in Vienna, also in Hungary. Asterisk, we'll come back to that. Revolution in Russia, revolution in Germany. People don't really talk about the German Revolution of 1918, 1919, but there was. There was a socialist revolution also attempted in Germany in 1918, 1919. And this, of course, this would have been the big formative experience for Benjamin. The World War and the revolution at the end of the World War. And the Russian Revolution was actually predicated on the German Revolution. So the Russian Revolution happened in 1917 when Germany defeated Russia. The German Revolution happened in 1918 on the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution, because they were defeated by the Entente, by the West. And anyway, but there had been an uprising in Germany during the war and a split in the German socialists during World War I in 1916, and Lenin, who's the great leader of the Russian Revolution, said the world revolution has begun. When this happened in Germany in 1916. So these are all bound up together. Okay, so this period, the Second Industrial Revolution, I mentioned it's also called the Belle Epoque and the Gilded Age. If Marx was a figure of 1848, this period of the Second Industrial Revolution is the period of Marxism. Meaning Marx
The
is
second what? Sorry.
Industrial Revolution.
Oh, the second.
And then there's a question of whether we've had a third Industrial Revolution or not. Right. The first Industrial Revolution is steam power. The Second Industrial Revolution is electromagnetic energy. And then we're still doing that. I think we're still doing electromagnetic. But people want to say cybernetics and the internet. So we're either in the third or the fourth Industrial Revolution, or we might just still be in the Second Industrial Revolution, in fact. The Marxism as a mass movement. So Marx was just a dude. There was a much broader socialist and communist movement, and he and Engels were like the party of two, or the folie à deux. They're the two buds, two whatever, drove each other to Hegelian madness or something. And they were very critical of the socialists of their time, extremely critical of the socialists of their time. Marxism, however, is a mass political ideology, and that emerges in the countries of the Second Industrial Revolution. That's where Marxism has the greatest influence. It has less influence in Britain and France. It has more influence in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, also in the United States. The United States had a socialist party that was Marxist as well before World War I. Eugene Debs. Right, so he was a labor leader, and then when he was in jail during a strike, his fellow striking labor prisoners were like, "Have you read Marx?" And so then he was converted to Marxism. So I mention all this because I mentioned that, so we've got Kant and Hegel, Neo-Kantianism. As a late 19th century phenomenon. And then, of course, there are other things that are going on. So Freud is a figure whose ideas are in this period of the Second Industrial Revolution. He first formulates his psychoanalytic approach to clinical therapy in the 1880s. So Freudianism is invented in the 1880s in the midst of this period. A lot of things are invented in this time. A lot of things are discovered, a lot of things are invented in this time. Radiation is discovered, microorganism source of disease is discovered, cinema is invented, flight, airplanes, cars, telephone, audio recording, film. Right? All that's before World War I. The telegraph was before the Second Industrial Revolution. Telephone is Second Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, I mentioned electricity. Obviously, electricity is a big deal. But Freudian psychoanalysis.
So we kind of have to be in the second industrial revolution because nothing's really done beyond those things that you're talking about that were.
Right, but that's controversial, right?
Besides, yeah, or you could say that like we're just computerizing the things that were already invented.
That's right. So in other words, it's still automation based on the principles of, oh, I forgot to mention, theory of relativity and quantum mechanics are also invented in this time, before World War I.
9 to 12, yeah.
Now, okay, so let me just fill it in. Baudelaire, I think we talked last week, modernity, modernism, did we? Yes, we did, okay. So, he coins the term modernity, and he really initiates modernism. And so I mentioned romanticism. So modernism as an outgrowth of romanticism is a circa 1848 phenomenon. Realism is a kind of parallel phenomenon circa 1830. It's another outgrowth from romanticism. So, and realism and modernism have a kind of fraught relationship. But modernism really comes out of romanticism, but so does realism. I mentioned Delacroix, Liberty Leaving the People. He's a romantic painter, but also one of the first realist painters. And he's also friends with Baudelaire anyway. So they're this whole business that we get into in the 20th century after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, socialist realism versus modernism. I mentioned this because starting next week we'll get into this. Benjamin is going to be a Marxist who is a critic and opponent of socialist realism and a champion of modernism. But that's not a great way of thinking about it. That's looked at from the standpoint of socialist realism condemning modernism. Of course, Benjamin is a critic of modernism, but he's a dialectical critic of modernism. And so, whereas socialist realism has an undialectical, just opposition to modernism as bourgeois decadence, Benjamin and his student Adorno, they are critics of modernism, but dialectical critics of modernism, meaning they see its necessity. They see the necessity of modernism as a function of capitalism. Even if it's a symptomatic, we'll get into it next time, symptomatic necessity, nonetheless it's a necessity. And of course socialist realism is symptomatic as well. Because Benjamin knows, or he knew, that the Soviet Union was not actually socialist, it didn't actually achieve socialism. It achieved something else. All right. So I mentioned all this. Benjamin, in World War I, in the experience of the revolutions, but also he read Georg Lukács, his book, History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, and that's really what converted Benjamin to Marxism. And Lukács, like Benjamin, they're a similar generation, were not Marxists before World War I. They were converted to Marxism as a function of the war and the revolution. And also similarly, they would have been in this kind of neo-Kantian and neo-Hegelian kind of moment of the pre-World War I intellectual world. One thing that I'll say about neo-Kantianism that Benjamin gets into is it's the breakup of the Kantian system. So we'll get into it a little bit later, but basically it's sort of Kantian philosophy becomes divided between epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and ontology. But we'll address that. So neo-Kantianism is not able to hold it together quite the way Kant himself was able to hold it together. Okay, so let's look at Benjamin's experience essay, because this word experience is actually going to be a very loaded word for Benjamin. And in fact, one of the ways it's a loaded word is that there are actually two words, both translated as experience in English, but actually two different words in German, but they both mean experience, but in two different ways. Okay, so this is when Benjamin, something that we'll read about in the Berlin Chronicle, or the Berlin Childhood circa 1900, that's an alternate title of the Berlin Chronicle. He's part of the youth movement before World War I. So these were young men and women, but mostly men, and very romantic, go off into the woods and read poetry, and etc. Right? Kind of bohemian, romantic.
Decadent?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, they're Nietzschean, so it could be decadent in the sense of embracing decadence, yes, in some way. But really some kind of more like, trying to discover meaning in the kind of emptiness of the modern world. Right? So I guess we're familiar with this. It's artists, it's writers. Right? Okay. In our struggle for responsibility, he writes, we fight against someone who is masked. The mask of the adult is called experience. It is expressionless, impenetrable, and ever the same. The adult has always already experienced, or laped, everything. Youth, ideals, hopes, woman, it was all illusion. Often we feel intimidated or embittered. Perhaps he is right. What can our retort be? We have not yet experienced or anything. Okay, so these are our two words, erlebnis and erfahrung. So basically, one is the sort of active experience, the one is the more passive experience. So something happening to you, that's an experience, or you doing something, that's an experience. So erlebt means you've lived through it, erfahrung means that you went through it, right? That would be the literal translations. And so they have these different connotations. They have the connotation of more of an active, like you're an object of experience. Active meaning you're a subject of experience versus passive, you're an object of experience. But let us attempt to raise the mask, he says. What has this adult experienced? What does he wish to prove to us? This above all, he too was once young. He too wanted what we wanted. He too refused to believe his parents. But life has taught him that they were right. Saying this, he smiles in a superior fashion. This will also happen to us. In advance, he devalues the years we will live, making them into the time of sweet youthful pranks, of childish rapture before the long sobriety of serious life. Thus the well-meaning, the enlightened. We know other pedagogues whose bitterness will not even concede to us the brief years of youth, serious and grim. They want to push us directly into life's drudgery. Both attitudes devalue and destroy our years. More and more we are assailed by the feeling our youth is but a brief night, filled with rapture. It will be followed by grand experience, the years of compromise and impoverishment of ideas and lack of energy. Such is life. That is what the adults tell us, and that is what they experienced. Yes, that is their experience, this one thing, never anything different, the meaninglessness of life. Its brutality. Have they ever encouraged us to anything great or new or forward-looking? Oh no, precisely because these things are things one cannot experience. All meaning, the true, the good, the beautiful, is grounded within itself. What then does experience signify? And herein lies the secret. because he never raises his eyes to the great and the meaningful, the Philistine has taken experience as his gospel. It has become for him a message about life's commonness. But he has never grasped that there exists something other than experience, that there are values inexperienceable which we serve. Why is life without meaning or solace for the Philistine? Because he knows experience and nothing else. Because he himself is desolate and without spirit. And because he has no inner relationship to anything other than the common and the always already out of date. We, however, know something different, which experience can neither give to us nor take away, that truth exists, even if all previous thought has been an error, or that fidelity shall be maintained, even if no one has done so yet. Such will cannot be taken from us by experience. Yes, yet our elders, with their tired gestures and their superior hopelessness, write about one thing, namely, that what we experience will be sorrowful, and that only in the inexperienceable can courage, hope, and meaning be given foundation. Then the spirit would be free, but again and again life would drag it down, because life, the sum of experience, would be without solace. We no longer understand such questions, however. Do we still lead the life of those unfamiliar with the spirit, whose sluggish ego is buffeted by life like waves against the rocks? No. Each of our experiences has its content. We ourselves invest them with content by means of our own spirit. He who is thoughtless is satisfied with error. You will never find the truth, he exclaims to the researcher. That is my experience. For the researcher, however, error is only an aid to truth. Spinoza. Only to the mindless or spiritless, geistless, is experience devoid of meaning and spirit. To the one who strives, experience may be painful, but it will scarcely lead him to despair. In any event, he would never obtusely give up and allow himself to be anesthetized by the rhythm of the Philistine. For the Philistine, you will have noted, only rejoices in every new meaninglessness. Don't do it, children. Postmodernism, no. Don't do it. It's Philistine. It's Philistine. Every new meaninglessness, no. He remains in the right. He reassures himself, spirit does not really exist. Geist does not really exist. Yet no one demands harsher submission or greater awe before the spirit. For if he were to become critical, then he would have to create as well. That he cannot do. Even the experience of spirit, which he undergoes against his will, becomes for him mindless. Tell him that when he becomes a man, he should revere the dreams of his youth. Nothing is so hateful to the Philistine as the dreams of his youth. And most of the time, sentimentality is the protective camouflage of this hatred. For what happened to him in his dreams was the voice of the spirit calling him once, what appeared to him, as it does everyone. It is of this that youth always reminds him, eternally and ominously. That is why he is antagonistic towards youth. He tells young people of that grim, overwhelming experience and teaches them to laugh at themselves, especially since to experience without spirit is comfortable if unredeeming. We're getting a lot of catchwords in this text. Redemption. Again, you know a different experience. It can be hostile to spirit and destructive to many blossoming dreams. Nevertheless, it is the most beautiful, most untouchable, most immediate, because it can never do without spirit while we remain. It can never be without spirit while we remain young. As Zarathustra says, there's your Nietzsche, the individual can experience himself only at the end of his wandering. The Philistine has his own experience. It is the eternal one of spiritlessness. The youth will experience spirit, and the less effortlessly he attains greatness, the more he will encounter spirit everywhere in his wanderings and in every person. When he becomes a man, the youth will be compassionate. The Philistine is intolerant. All right, let's unpack this. So, true, good, and beautiful, we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to Kant and his essay on the coming philosophy, Benjamin. He's got some other Kantianisms here. So he's got Nietzsche, he's got Zarathustra. Nietzsche thought that Zarathustra was his best book. Maybe. It's like the novel version of his philosophy. It's wacky. It's okay, but he's got better things than that. All right, so truth exists even if all previous thought was an error. That's Kant. And fidelity shall be maintained even if no one has done so yet. So we're obligated to act morally even if no one has ever acted morally. Right? We are bound to seek the truth even if no one has done so yet. And we're bound to treat ourselves as free even if no free act has ever been taken. That kind of contradiction is what we know as dialectics, by the way, because it starts with Kant, not with Hegel. Experience is also the main category of Kant's philosophy. In other words, Kant's philosophy is concerned primarily with philosophy hitherto, up to that time, not being able to account for experience. So what is meant by experience here? So I mentioned the passive and the active. Actually, it's both. It's not one or the other. It's both. It's transformative experience. So did we look at, I don't think that we did. But let's go through Kant and then we'll look at another set of terms. We didn't do being and becoming last week, did we?
No.
We did not. Okay. Sorry. So here's Kant's philosophy charted in a nutshell. Okay, so Kant, critical philosophy, and we had that term critical in the Benjamin. What did he say about being critical? In order to be critical, you'd have to be capable of creating. So, Kant's critical philosophy was written in the form of 3 critiques. And those 3 critiques correspond to the ancient virtues. The 3 virtues, the true, the good, and the beautiful. So his first critique of pure reason, is about understanding, the faculty of understanding. In other words, how can we have a true understanding of things? How do we have a true use of concepts and a true theory of things? How is that possible? So critique here doesn't mean criticism or debunking or opposition or deconstruction. Critique means exploring conditions of possibility. Exploring conditions of possibility for these faculties of the subject. So how do we know the true? How do we use our understanding? How is that faculty possible? And more importantly, how can it change? So what happens to the category of truth if we look back historically or we're living through a time where the truth changes? Where what was true is no longer true. For the ancients, the virtues corresponded to divine principles that were eternal and unchanging. In other words, what made them virtues, what made them principles, was that they were unchanging and eternal in character. So what is true has always been true and will always be true. What is good, what is morally good, and what is beneficial, good in that sense as well, has always been good and will always be good. What we consider to be beautiful was always beautiful and will always be beautiful. Kant is trying to explore philosophically how that is not the case, how the truth changes without invalidating the category of the true, how the morally good and also the beneficial, the practically beneficial, changes without invalidating the category of the good, and of course the beautiful, what we experience as beautiful changes without invalidating the concept of the beautiful. So the first critique is about epistemology. It's epistemology. It's the understanding, it's theory, it's concepts. It's what he calls concepts of nature. So concepts of nature, concepts of the way the world is. Concepts of the way the world is. And the necessity of the world being as it is. The second critique is corresponding to the good, and he calls it an exploration of practical reason. So not pure reason, but practical reason. Critique of practical reason. Or reason, simply reason, as opposed to understanding. Reason, which is the realm of morality, desire, and practice. So how do we attain the good in practice with our reason? And also, why do we want the things that we want? Kant's influenced by Rousseau. Rousseau has this radical view of society and history and human nature, where society is the realm where we create new needs for ourselves that we wouldn't have in nature, and yet they become real needs. So there are artificial, cultural, social, societal needs that are generated that we wouldn't have as natural organisms, but nonetheless they become part of our nature, they become second nature, and they become real. And therefore, we transform the realm of necessity. We create new necessity for ourselves. And we do that with our reason. And actually, that's how we are free. We're free because, unlike animals, we create new needs for ourselves beyond our physical and biological needs. The animals just act according to their physical and biological needs. We create new needs for ourselves that the animals don't have. So we have a need for things like religion, art, language, that we don't really have as organisms. As natural creatures, we don't have a need for art or even language, really. So we have, and certainly not religion, and not like all the social forms that we have, law, everything. Like, we don't need any of those things as animals. We create these needs, though, and now they've become part of our nature. And that's the realm of freedom. That's the realm of freedom. So,
Seems like the opposite.
of what we usually think, right? But that's because we have like anarcho-primitivist or biologistic ideas, which the Nazis were into too. They were like, the Jews have colonized Europe, and they have imposed on the Aryan peoples these set of needs that we don't really have. We need to be Aryans, not this commercial culture of the Mediterranean world that the Jews have subjected us to. Which is why the Jews had to be exterminated. Because as long as they were around, they would infiltrate the good Aryan people with their alien values. Because the Aryan, I should say, the Aryan values were what? Like Vikings, like kick-ass, like whatever, conquest, right? Because, by the way, that's what the Germans did. They conquered Europe. They conquered Rome. Yeah. And then they went on and conquered the rest of Europe. Something that we'll talk about. So why is England England and not Britain? Because it was conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. Why is France France and not Gaul? Because it was conquered by the Franks. Yeah. So, and they installed themselves as the aristocracy in those countries, the Germans.
Regarding the appropriation of Nietzsche,
Uh-huh.
is this where they would like implement like master and slave morality, kind of like there's?
Well, that was in the ancient Mediterranean world too,
Okay.
right? And the Germans had a slightly different way of doing it than the Greeks and the Romans, slavery, that they could be proud of. But they were like better slave masters than the Greeks and the Romans were, or than the other Mediterraneans were, the Egyptians, the Jews themselves, right? Escaped slavery, but then had slaves, of course.
Yeah.
Right. We're going to get into that next week with Proust, because Proust is going to have this fascination with people's faces and deep, just like a description of faces. Why? It's race. It's race, right? So it's about because the aristocracy was a different race from the common people. They were a different race, and literally because they were Germanic, whereas the common people were Celts. And in the capitalist era of the 19th century, class becomes racialized in a new way, in a kind of biological way that it hadn't been before. Before it was more like cultural, it was understood very differently. It became biologized and kind of reified in the capitalist era in the 19th century. So you get a kind of new kind of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. So there was traditional anti-Semitism, but then you have like the new anti-Semitism to the point where the Nazis had to go back and discover whether people who didn't think that they were Jewish had Jewish ancestry like generations back, because they also had to be killed. Right? People who had long converted or intermarried or whatnot, still had to be killed. Okay, we'll leave the rest aside for now. All right, so let's turn to the program of the coming philosophy and see what you guys have to say about this. All right, so let's look at his thesis statement. So this is an unpublished essay, so it's a little bit, it's got an unfinished character to it. I mean, it is a whole, it's fully written, but maybe not entirely polished. The central task of the coming philosophy will be to take the deepest intimations it draws from our times and our expectation of a great future and turn them into knowledge by relating them to the Kantian system. The historical continuity that is ensured by following the Kantian system is also the only such continuity of decisive and systematic consequence. For Kant is the most recent of those philosophers for whom what mattered was not primarily the scope and depth of knowledge, but first and foremost its justification. And with the exception of Plato, he is perhaps the only one. Both of these philosophers share a confidence that the knowledge of which we can give the clearest account will also be the most profound. They have not dismissed the demand for depth in philosophy, but they have found their own unique way of meeting it by identifying it with the demand for justification. The more unpredictably and boldly the development of future philosophy announces itself, the more deeply it must struggle for certainty, whose criterion is systematic unity or truth. Okay, so Plato and Kant. All right, so Plato invented philosophy, kind of. There are pre-Socratic philosophers, and there's Socrates, who in some ways can be understood as the inventor of philosophy. Then there's Aristotle. So there's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Aristotle really kind of fully develops philosophy in a more systematic way, and then he is the one who is the Platonist, Aristotle, who's the most influential. In the Muslim world, Aristotle is called the teacher or the philosopher, like just period. What we're dealing with here is two historical beginnings of philosophy. One is the ancient, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Plato being the one who is he's sort of ventriloquizing through Socrates, meaning the Socrates we have is Plato's version. May or may not be the actual Socrates. And then Kant invented philosophy anew. Revolutionary philosophy, new philosophy. Hegel described it this way. He said Kant invented philosophy, and then Hegel said that he completed philosophy. Hegel completed it. And the reason for that, it's called the 25 years of philosophy. The reason for that, the reason Hegel completed it, and then it was done, was because the world had become philosophical. Meaning, after that, everyone's a philosopher, and therefore, we're going to develop philosophy in real life rather than as a formal system. That didn't happen. Why? Capitalism? Capitalism? So, meaning capitalism introduces a kind of self-alienation that prevents the world from being the free interplay of theory and practice and everyone being philosophical in the way that Hegel expected. Right, so do you guys know the church lady from Saturday Night Live?
Yeah.
Okay. Could it be Satan? Right, so that's going to be the answer to every why question in the course. Could it be capitalism? Right, so whatever happens, especially bad, could it be Satan? Could it be capitalism? Right. Because we're going to see capitalism is pretty totalizing concept for Benjamin and for Marxism. It doesn't just mean the economic system, it's everything. It's our psychology. It's our psychology. All right, so now justification, meaning how can knowledge or really experience justify itself to itself? Meaning, can we recognize ourselves? Can we justify what we think we know, what we think we understand, what we think we've experienced? Can we explain it to ourselves with justification? In some ways, that goes back to an earlier bourgeois philosopher before Kant, and that's Descartes. So, cogito ergo sum. So, I think, therefore I am. Meaning the principle of certainty. What is the principle of certainty? And how do we overcome doubt, skepticism, solipsism? So according to Descartes, it's that we're asking the question, what can we be certain of? What is it that I can't doubt? What's the one thing I can't doubt? I can doubt everything. Am I in this classroom? Are we having this conversation about Benjamin and Marxism? I can doubt that. What I can't doubt is that I'm asking the question of what I can doubt. That's the one thing I can be certain of. Everything else is open to doubt and skepticism. The one thing I can be certain of is that I'm asking the question, what can I be certain of? And Kant is very Descartes follower, Cartesian. And Descartes has a bad name. Postmodernism has given everything a bad name. Kant has a bad name. But Descartes has a bad name because it's mind-body dualism or whatever. No. That's not a good way of thinking about it. No. Actually, Descartes, like a lot of people in the 1600s, was trying to overcome the ghost in the machine problem. In other words, was trying to precisely overcome the mind-body dualism that's naively assumed. Right? So was Kant. Okay, so justification, certainty. Justification, certainty. What can we be certain of? We can't be certain of things or of the world. We can only be certain of our own subjectivity of it. So all the things that philosophy was concerned with before Kant was about positing metaphysical assertions about the world and about things. So Kant's revolution is actually philosophy is not about things or the world, it's about us. It's about our faculties. So truth doesn't exist in the world, it only exists as a function of our faculties, of our subjectivity. Meaning the truth is subjective. Nonetheless, it's real. How is the truth real while being subjective? Because we change the world. We affect things. Right? So the truth of theoretical physics, right? They postulated black holes before they observed them in space. They postulated the transformability of matter into energy, and it was proven by the atomic weapons. right? So we've also done things with quantum mechanics and with theory of relativity. We've created forms of matter and energy that don't exist in nature. Right? So it's subjective, but nonetheless true. Without us thinking, oh, we finally got it, meaning the assumption being that even though we have effective, practical knowledge, that will change in the future. We'll have a new theory. Like, in other words, theory of relativity, quantum mechanics won't be the last word. It has been the last word up till now, and that might also be because we're still in capitalism. No. And still in the second industrial revolution. That might be why we haven't gotten beyond quantum mechanics and theory of relativity, because we might not have gotten beyond electromagnetism as a basic ontological realm. So the idea would be the reason that Newton didn't understand relativity or quantum mechanics is that it didn't exist yet. Like, Newtonian physics was adequate to its time, and it was true, even though now we know it's not true. It's true 90% of the time. You're figuring out a car crash, if you're an insurance adjuster, figuring out the physics of a car crash, Newtonian physics will be adequate. You don't need theory of relativity and quantum mechanics for that, actually. But you need it for other things. Right, so truth is subjective, nonetheless it's still true, it's real. Right, so this is meant to overcome the dualism of absolutism and relativism. Also meant to overcome the dualism or antinomy of empiricism and rationalism. Meaning, do we only know the world through sense perception, or do we know it through a priori categories of cognition? Kant says it's both and neither. Old empiricism, old rationalism. He was responding, Kant, to Hume, who said that our theories have no substance. Theory has no substance. Theory is just a fiction. Right? The only thing that has substance is sense data perception. But the theory that we derive from our sense data perception itself has no substance, whereas Kant says, no, it does have a substance. Meaning, metaphysical assertions, which are what theories are, do have a substance, but that substance is in our practical relation to the world, not in the world in itself. So metaphysics has a real object. It's not external to us, but it's internal to us, and it's not only internal, but also relational. It has to do with our practical relation to the world. So metaphysics describes our relation to things, which changes. And therefore, a traditional notion of metaphysics won't work because we're constantly changing. Changing our practices, changing our metaphysical relations, and therefore changing our theories, and changing our understanding and our concepts. So this is the Kantian revolution. Practice comes before theory because our theoretical relation to the world is ultimately grounded in a practical relation to the world. If this sounds like Marx, it's because it is Marx, meaning Marx is Kantian, because Hegel is Kantian, and Marx is Hegelian and Kantian. Okay, so what we're dealing with his coming of the, or the program of the coming philosophy, coming of the new philosophy, is that this Kantian philosophy is in crisis. Meaning, super influential in some ways, we haven't transcended the Kantian horizon. So all the postmodernists at the end of their lives are like, yeah, we haven't really gotten beyond Kant. So Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, I think even Lacan, Heidegger, like all of them were like, we tried to overcome Kant, but in the end we failed. We're still in the Kantian universe. Okay. So, nonetheless, Kantianism is not entirely satisfying, meaning there has been this struggle with Kantianism ever since the capitalist era, ever since the 1800s. And also struggle with and against Hegelianism. So if we do Kant and Hegel as a pair, the 25 years of philosophy, German idealist philosophy, modern idealist philosophy, it's nonetheless been in crisis since after Hegel's time. Also, science and philosophy diverged in the 1800s in a way that wasn't yet the case in the 1700s, in the Enlightenment. Science and philosophy seemed to take a divergent path. Nietzsche, we'll talk about later, but Nietzsche traces the problem back to what he calls the birth of theoretical man with Socrates. So it's the idea that truth became divided between three realms: the true, the good, and the beautiful. So it became divided between science, philosophy, and art. Right? Whereas for the ancient peoples, these were unified. Now for us, they're divided. And first he thinks that's because we made a mistake, and then later he realizes, no, it was necessary. That these things became distinct and antagonistic to each other. Again, I'm filling in the kind of Nietzschean, the Nietzsche-Kant dialogue that's in the background here with Benjamin. So he says we need a Kantian account of experience, but also the danger is that Kant reduces experience to its nadir, to its minimal point, and so therefore we're left wanting. Right, so in that way, he thinks there's a task of a new philosophy that both has to fulfill but go beyond Kant, and precisely in the description or account of experience. So you guys, do you have some notes on this? So we've got, do you want to do it via the slides?
Yeah,
Slides.
we could do.
Oops.
Huh?
I thought we were gonna get away with not doing it.
Yeah, just
No. Yeah, so let's, you just got 2 slides?
No. We have slides with quotes later, so.
Oh, I see. Okay, good. All right, so
Yeah.
let's do the slideshow. So where do you guys start?
Oh, it's just the general outline, so we.
Yeah, we can't, I think we should start, since we were also just doing Kant, Sasha's portion is, continues with Kant.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great.
So basically, it was really challenging reading. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely, because it's not only Benjamin's dialogue with Kant that was evolving there, but not you, I personally had to go, had to address what Kant was thinking about, to understand this lineage of idea. And so basically, the question that was central to Benjamin's text here, as to my understanding, and which was triggering Kant and philosophers that he had referred to, was how we get our knowledge. Yeah, and so in pre-Kantian philosophy, we can in a very sketch-like and simplified way divide it. We can divide it into 2 parts. Yeah, so there were rationalists and there were empiricists. Rationalists believed that knowledge, the source of knowledge, is reason, and there are innate ideas like the following. We can look at the following slide with the scheme. So substance, cause, and God, through which we can perceive, interpret reality. Yeah, and so for them, the main problem with rationalists that they believed in direct access to pure reason. Yeah, and then we have empiricists who believed that only sensory experience on the following, is the way we can touch a little bit reality. I'm talking about touch because touch is just a point, the contact. So this touch evolves into phenomena, something that we perceive, but we cannot grasp the reality in its entity. So we are forced into like partial understanding of what is given to us physically. And this part of empiricists was presented by Hume, and Kant, although he didn't agreed totally with Hume, he was his ally basically, and he called him his alarm clock from this dogmatic slumber. And so what was this basically slumber, and what Kant suggested? He suggested that we have a posteriori experiences like Hume believed in, so what we see, what we feel, what we erleb, if to address Benjamin's text, so what we physically experience, and we have some a priori categories. So we have some ideas, some installed hardware, categories that we are born with. So like the sense of category of space, for instance, of volume, etc. And so the world
time is very, very important, we'll see.
And time. And so the world is neither in our heads nor fully out there. And while our knowledge begins with experience, it would collapse into meaningless if we don't fit onto it this framework. So that was of a priori categories. That's what Kant was talking about. But what was Benjamin's issue with Kant? So the next slide. So Benjamin said that Kant's epistemology, he called it not radical enough. So and in this sense, I feel the spirit of his experience essay, where he accuses grown-ups in being not curious, in being not creative and not daring. And he says that it doesn't really depart from metaphysics, against which Kant he wasn't against metaphysics, but he tried to challenge it a little bit. And because Kant, he still preserves this division between subject and thing in itself, so the outer world that we have to deal somehow. And so there is, in Kant's philosophy, there is a cognizing mind, the mind that thinks, and an object that he projects his thinking onto. And it still doesn't eliminate this division. And from Benjamin, philosophy should avoid this division. It should avoid this crack, and Kant's transcendental identity. I think that he is still not sufficient. For overcoming it. So for Benjamin, he says that Kant still very much relies on empirical consciousness, and for epistemology, we need to get rid of any this subjectivity. And what's interesting, when he says about this empirical consciousness, once again we can link here to his experience essay, because he talks about Philistine experience, about this very basic layman experience, daily experience. And he calls that this, when we rely on this daily experience to understand the reality, it creates this madness, schizophrenic split. And he calls it the following. We can address the following slide. Once again, if we could not, the following. So what really was triggering for me when I read this passage, it is the insistent repentance of the word mythology. I was thinking, why mythology? Why is he so aggressive towards mythological thinking? Because for me, it's a beautiful type of worldview, and here it is used in a clearly derogatory way. But when I was evolving onto this in my mind onto this passage, I understood that for Benjamin, mythological thinking are like mental crutches. That help stepping through this split of subjective and objective. And that's why he addresses this. So he shows the examples in this passage of mad people with mental illnesses that project themselves onto outer objects, that identify themselves with external things. Actually, mythological worldview is very coherent. It is very unified. But Benjamin, he says that it is a very artificial unity. And the same way, this idea of cognizing self that Kant suggests is also this crutch. Because Kant never comes to the point. He thinks how we get knowledge, but he doesn't ask what is knowledge. And for Benjamin, the question of what is knowledge is central, but he says that it's unsolvable on the level of this essay. So what we can, if we go to the next slide, we can see that Benjamin, he attempts to diagnose the current philosophy, and he diagnoses it as melancholic. For universal philosophical interest is continually directed toward both the timeless validity of knowledge and the certainty of a temporal experience. So two absolutely opposite directions. And if we recall what Freud wrote in his essay, ambivalence is one of key characteristics of melancholia. It's a very probably interesting diagnosis that Benjamin makes to then current philosophy. But I personally diagnosed Benjamin with maniac study of his perceptions.
Reacting against the melancholia.
So he reacts against melancholia, and if we go to Freud's quote, in melancholia, countless separate struggles are carried out over the object, in which hate and love connected with each other. The one seeks to detach the libido from the object, and the other to maintain this position of the libido against the assault. And this can evolve then into new fixation. And for Benjamin, the new fixation is his program of common philosophy that is actually filled with optimism, groundless, because there is no common philosophy yet. He suggests no clear ideas and theses for this philosophy. And it is excessive energy that he puts, especially towards the end of the essay. So his project is outlined in messianic words and manner. So he wants to heal philosophy. He wants to gather fragments and to establish the neutral sphere of philosophy. I don't want to say that Benjamin was maniac himself, or that or that this idea is pathological itself. How can we go around this text? It's to agree with Benjamin, and to take not a typical Western-centric position, but to refer to Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism. And especially since he mentions in the notes Gerchem Scholem, one of Jewish mystics, and in Kabbalah there are several ideas that help us to grasp probably what Benjamin was talking about. So there are the ideas of Shevirat HaKelim, which is shattering of divine vessel. So basically this was the idea that the whole divine light was at the beginning of creation contained in a vessel, and the power of this light was so intense that the vessel cracked. And so light lost its form, it started spreading in fragments. And Freud talks about fragmentary perception that we have. Benjamin also he adopts this idea of fragmentary, and it is longing to cure this fragmentation and to overcome it. And there is an idea of tikkun, repair of this vessel, to assemble it. It could be done through devekut, which is clinging to God. Basically, prayer, not like Benjamin is secular and he doesn't call for prayer, but this idea of uniting subject and object, in almost devotional way, is the way to restitute this integrity that was at the beginning. So it kind of some mystical ideas that were, if I'm not mistaken, later developed in Benjamin's writing. They are feasible already in this.
So Scholem is his friend, and I think Scholem might have even been part of the youth movement with him. Let me say something, a couple of things. So we talked about Plato and Kant. So Platonic idealism versus Kantian idealism. So Platonic, because this is a little bit non-standard Kant that you're getting here, because it's really based on the later Kant, the other critiques, not just the first critique. And but anyway, what's the easiest way of? I might have to use another board. Use this board. So, okay, Platonic idealism, let's get that out of the way first, because you had phenomena and noumena, noumenal and phenomenal. So, Plato, it's a complicated thing because whether he meant this literally or not, it's unclear. Probably he didn't mean it literally, but he nonetheless posited that the world doesn't have straight lines or circles or rectilinear forms. Those things don't exist in nature. But we have these ideas of them. We have these mathematical, geometrical ideas. So there must be an ethereal realm of eternal forms somewhere. And then the world that we live in, there must be a noumenal realm, an ethereal realm of eternal forms, a noumenal realm. And then the phenomenal world that we inhabit must be an imperfect projection of that noumenal world. So the idea is that there's a kind of a split between appearance and essence. So we only get a kind of false, deceptive, imperfect appearance of what are true essences. We don't know true essences phenomenally, but only ideally. Like I said, he brings this up. It might be semi-ironical, the way Plato puts it, actually. Especially because he is Socratic and Socrates is like, we can never know, right? So like, whatever. So it might just be an exercise of that. Kant says, no, there isn't, that we don't have to posit, even as a thought experiment, a noumenal realm, an ethereal realm of eternal forms, of noumena. Rather, we can think of it another way, which is, why do we have these ideas of straight lines and circles and rectilinear forms that don't exist in nature, that don't exist phenomenally in nature? Because we want them to exist in practice. We desire them, and then we make them happen in practice. Right, so that's the prior practice before theory. So we have a practical need for straight lines, circles, rectilinear forms. Then we get our idea from that desire, and then, or from the practical need, and then we implement it in practice. So it's a dialectic of theory and practice that way. And of course, he's also Rousseauian Kant, which means where do we get the need for straight lines, circles, and rectilinear forms and other things? From society. We don't generate them individually, we only generate them together in collective practice in society. Because it's only in society that we practice in a way that the animals don't, and that we would not as animals. So that's Platonic idealism versus Kantian idealism, and therefore the metaphysical, like, it's not like, oh, the metaphysical objects, like circles and lines and rectilinear forms, no, they exist in our practical relation to things, like I said earlier. Okay. So we don't know the world in terms of things in themselves or the world in itself. We only know objects. So one way of thinking about it is, it's a dialectic of subject and object, and that's why they seem to be separate. Dialectic of subject and object, and it's through that the thing, we don't know the thing in itself, we only know it as an object. So we only know it through a process of objectification, which is also a process of subjectification. So there is no subject without an object. There's no subjectivity without objectivity. And the way that develops is that we take what he calls the sensuous manifold, because there aren't even really things in the world. There's just a flux of matter and energy. There's just the sensuous manifold. And then we objectify that and create things out of that sensuous flux of matter and energy. And then they become objects. And that's how we become subjects. We become subjects by objectifying the world. Okay, so, which is a process of subjectification. Okay, so the argument with sense data perception is that sense data perception can only account for moments in space and time when we're perceiving things. And yet, we have a subjectivity that transcends all of our moments of experience. Right, so that's the transcendental subject. Which he says is characterized by not sense data perception, but the unity of apperception. Meaning, the subject is not unified through its sense data perception, which varies in time and space from moment to moment. The unity of the subject comes through our apperceptive capacity, meaning our capacity to perceive our own perception. So we don't just perceive, we also perceive our perception. Apperceptive capacities, and that's the unity of the subject, the transcendental subject. Because we need to demystify these things. Meaning, transcendental subject, what is it? It's like the soul separate from the body or something like that? Well, no. it's a function of our subjectivity and our perceptive capacities. Right? Our first naive notion of that is, well, there's a soul that's separate from the body because the soul is irreducible to the body's physical states from one moment to another. Right? There's a personality. There's transcendental psychology. That's another term from the 1700s. Meaning we don't just have momentary impressions. We have a notion of ourselves that carries us through our experiences. Okay. Okay, we dealt with rationalism and idealism. Okay, so the object. Okay, so the object. So I mentioned that Benjamin, not in this text, not in the 1918 program of Becoming Philosophy, but later. So why does he find Marxism to have answered the question that he's posing here? Because he reads Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, and in that, the central category is reification. Reification. In other words, capitalism reifies things. Reification literally just means thingify. So it's the thingification. So what this means is that there's something going on in capitalism that causes us to become alienated from this process of objectification and subjectification, such that the object appears to revert to a thing in itself. So there's a kind of alienation, self-alienation of the subject that causes the object to appear separate from us rather than something that we're in a practical relation with. This is based on Marx's idea of commodity fetishism. Since we're going to talk about Freud, let's just get rid of the first misunderstanding about this. It's not psychological. It's not a sexual fetish. It's not a fetish in the Freudian sense. Why? Because Marx was written before Freud. So it's anthropological fetish, meaning it's analogized to religion and mythology, because of course mythology comes from religion. And so the idea, this is going to be a central idea because you brought up myth and mythology, the dialectic of enlightenment and myth. Meaning every myth is a form of enlightenment, but then when that changes, then the prior form of enlightenment we see as a myth. Right? So capitalism is a process of enlightenment that is at the same time a self-mythologization of this enlightenment. Right? So commodity fetishism, which is related to not only alienation, but ideology, and which is called false consciousness. False consciousness, ideology. Right, so the enlightenment that bourgeois society allowed us has become ideological, it's become self-mythologizing, it's become fetishized, because capitalism means that we need to go beyond bourgeois ideology, but then we cling to bourgeois ideology as like our myth, or as Benjamin wrote in another essay, it's become our religion. So bourgeois society has become our religion, and it has its own mythology, and this is his understanding of ideology and false consciousness. Now, false consciousness and ideology, we're going to get into this more throughout the semester, but I'll just mention this. It's not false in the sense of simply wrong. It's false in the sense of it's true, but it shouldn't be assumed and naturalized because it has to change. So it is true, but it's also not true because it needs to be changed. So it's only false because it's true. But its truth is its falsehood because it has to be changed, it has to be overcome. So this is Hegelian dialectics. Right, so the false is just a moment in the truth, and the truth becomes false once we change things. Okay. And even though this sounds completely whacked out, it actually has very precise meaning. Like, in other words, this is actually a very kind of rational, sober view of things. And so I mentioned commodity fetishism. What that really is labor fetishism. So we'll get into this later, but the idea is that the Industrial Revolution fundamentally changes our societal metaphysics. So bourgeois society coming out of the Renaissance replaces the moral system of religion with the practical metaphysics of labor. And then the Industrial Revolution throws the practical metaphysics of labor into crisis, because now we have machines doing things that humans used to do. And so the machine activity transcends what humans can do, but because we haven't mastered it, we read that last time, to the planetarium, because we haven't yet societally mastered the power of technology, technology turns around and destroys us. And so the bourgeois ideology of false consciousness is that we're still living in a society of the work ethic, meritocracy, etc. Right? That's bourgeois ideology, whereas in fact, the society we live in has very little to do with the work ethic or meritocracy. It has a lot more to do with technology and science. And yet we haven't politically mastered the system of technology and science, and so therefore it becomes this alien realm that seems to oppress us. It seems to be a demonic force, like Heidegger thought it was. And so, we try to put society back together on the basis of bourgeois ideology. We invent new forms of work, new forms of people earning a living, like being an adjunct professor in an art school, that society may or may not actually need. Right? But it helps keep the system going, to pay people, to teach people who pay tuition.
Who will then come to teach
To
people.
to fund banks and financial institutions through student loan debt, et cetera, grease the wheels of the system. Okay, so we do live in a real metaphysics, but that metaphysical world that we live in is in crisis. And therefore, when we think we have it mentally, it's a myth of it itself. All right, so this is very different from the religious idea, because the religious idea is that this is a mystery, that it comes from God. It doesn't. It comes from us. And it's not just a mystery. It's not about like knowledge that's withheld from us by God. It's about what we haven't figured out yet, but that we have to try to figure out. But we can always fool ourselves into thinking that we don't need to figure it out through mythology. So we can hold back our enlightenment by taking the previous high point of enlightenment and freezing it, and then accepting that as the permanent truth, but that's actually mythology. Right, so we now have the mythology of bourgeois society, that's our myth. We don't have the ancient myths, which seemed a lot more interesting, colorful. We just have the bourgeois myth. We have the puritanical Protestant work ethic, infernal machine myth.
Can you explain again? So on faith, I'll take that Benjamin is diagnosing neo-Kantianism as melancholic, or can you? So he says at the end of Melancholia, he breaks it down to loss of the object, ambivalence, regression of the libido into the ego. Using the terms of neo-Kantianism, can you explain what of those three portions of Melancholia, what is Benjamin identifying in neo-Kantianism?
That would be Freud, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, that would be Freud. Let's so remind us again, what are the three things?
Loss of the object, ambivalence, regression of libido into the ego, which causes self-hatred.
Narcissism.
Yeah.
Narcissism, yes.
Wasn't there also truth too? Like, wasn't Freud like there isn't a one truth? There isn't like a. Wasn't I like mixing them up?
Oh, there's also, yes. There is a kind of
Like the ego talks us into, or something like that. Like, and so we each have a different perception, interpretation of reality, or something like that.
oh, well, there certainly is that. Right, okay. But as a function of melancholia. Right.
I was thinking more as of like compared to like how Benjamin and Kant were comparing pure knowledge, I guess. That like he was saying like there wasn't really pure knowledge because we all distort it.
Well, let me say something about this before. We'll take a little break and then we'll come back and do Freud. But let me say something about this. So first of all, and I'll try to tie it into your question. So for Freud, the neurotic, but really everyone, lives in a fantasy world, right? So basically, we have a kind of, our personality is this massive defense mechanism through which we experience things. We experience ourselves, we experience external reality, we experience our own memories of things through a kind of fantasy screen, PH fantasy screen. And that neurotics basically have a kind of self-defeating version of what otherwise helps people function. Right, so there isn't a kind of hard division between the healthy and the pathological. Because the healthy is just the more like effective, less conflicted version of the pathological. Whereas the pathological is the more internally conflicted version of what everyone does psychologically. So the idea is that mental illness is not a difference in kind, only difference of degree. Meaning everyone has like psychotic states, neurotic states, but some people are completely taken over by those, right? And really it's about treating neurosis, not psychosis. That's an important point because melancholia shades into the psychotic and then it becomes untreatable as far as Freud is concerned. It's not something that you can treat through the talking cure because the therapist is not a real enough external person to the person suffering from melancholia. So therapy can't reach the person. They're too narcissistic to allow the psychotherapy to reach them. But you know, everything's on a spectrum. So everyone is more or less neurotic and everyone is more or less psychotic. And certainly there are stresses that we experience stresses, traumas that cause us to regress to neurotic states. And then there are some stresses and traumas that make us even regress to psychotic states. And both those are understood as traumas, adult triggering experiences that overwhelm our defenses. Right? And so then we kind of mobilize these more infantile defenses to try to help us, and that's how he understands neurosis. Is that things that we dealt with when we were very young that were extremely overwhelming to us, when those don't work, like when our more developed personality doesn't work as adults, then we retreat to things that worked when we were younger. But that proves to be impractical and self-defeating in adult life. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to take a break, but the last thing I want to say about the Kant bit, about space and time. Space and time, very, very, very important. Okay, space and time. So I mentioned theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. Okay. And we also know from the Paul Valery epigraph to the beginning of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction that ancient notions of the beautiful and space and time and matter and energy no longer apply. No longer apply. Right. Okay, so what Kant said was that space and time are necessary categories of our subjectivity. However, what space is and what time is changes. So culturally, they already knew this in the 1700s. They were already, it's the colonial era, it's the era of discovery, and also historically looking back on, so-called Western history, but looking at non-Western culture, it's clear that everyone has notions of space and time, but what those notions of space and time are concretely has varied across history. So the invariant is, to be a subject, you have to have a notion of space and time, but the variable is what it is, what it actually is. Right, so space and time are eternal only in the sense of you have to have some notion of space and some notion of time. But what the actual content of that is practically has changed and will change. So that's the idea. So we live in a different spatial and temporal universe than people in medieval Europe, or even people in the Renaissance, or people in classical antiquity. Right? Because at a practical level, physical space and time is altered. Right? We didn't always live in grids, in the grid space. The grid space is a Renaissance invention, and this kind of weird thing that we do. Also, clock time. That's an invention too. So metrical time. We didn't always find metrical time practical, and whether it is practical is a question, but it is, right? Because time used to be much more concrete. It used to be the time to do this or the time to do that. The time to cook rice, the time to boil water, right? It was concrete time, whereas now, clock time.
But
Right.
the time was like
Secular.
cyclical. Yeah, now it's
Linear. Yeah, that's when we get into history. History is going to be very important that way. So Plato, for example, had a notion of history, but it was cyclical, whereas our notion of history is linear. And it's still cyclical, but in a kind of repressed way. And then we'll see how the cyclical and the linear are related. Because also for Plato, it was linear, but in a different way than the way we use it. All right, so that was just my last little asterisk on the space and time question with Kant. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and look at the Freud. All right, let's resume. Let's resume.
Sorry.
So let's start with Freud's on transience essay, because it will help us get a handle on things in a less clinical, metapsychological way that the Mourning and Melancholia does. Okay, so he writes, this is during the war, Third World War I. Not long ago, I went on a summer walk through a smiling countryside in the company of a taciturn friend and of a young but already famous poet. The poet admired the beauty of the scene around us, but felt no joy in it. He was disturbed by the thought that all this beauty was fated to extinction, that it would vanish when winter came, like all human beauty and all the beauty and splendor that men have created or may create. All that he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him to be shorn of its worth by the transience, which was its doom. The proneness to decay of all that is beautiful and perfect can, as we know, give rise to two different impulses in the mind. The one leads to the aching despondency felt by the young poet, while the other leads to rebellion against the fact asserted. No, it is impossible that all this loveliness of nature and art, of the world of our sensations and of the world without, will really fade away into nothing. It would be too senseless and too presumptuous to believe it. Somehow or other, this loveliness must be able to persist and to escape all the powers of destruction. But this demand for immortality is a product of our wishes, too unmistakable to lay claim to reality. What is painful may nonetheless be true. That's a good statement to always keep in mind. Right? There are a lot of things you don't want to believe because it's too painful, but nonetheless might be true. Usually, the truth hurts. I could not see any way, or my way, to dispute the transience of all things, nor could I insist upon an exception in favor of what is beautiful and perfect. But I did dispute the pessimistic poet's view that the transience of what is beautiful involves any loss of its worth. On the contrary, an increase. Transience value is scarcity value in time. Limitation in the possibility of an enjoyment raises the value of the enjoyment. It was incomprehensible, I declared, that the thought of the transience of beauty should interfere with our joy in it. As regards the beauty of nature, each time it is destroyed by winter, it comes again next year. So that in relation to the length of our lives, it can in fact be regarded as eternal. The beauty of the human form and face vanish forever in the course of our own lives, but their evanescence only lends them a fresh charm. A flower that blossoms only for a single night does not seem to us on that account any less lovely. Nor can I understand any better why the beauty and perfection of a work of art or of an intellectual achievement should lose its worth because of its temporal limitation. A time may indeed come when the pictures and statues which we admire today will crumble to dust, Or a race of men may follow us who no longer understand the works of our poets and thinkers. Or a geological epoch may even arrive when all the animate life on the earth ceases. But since the value of all this beauty and perfection is determined only by its significance for our own emotional lives, it has no need to survive us and is therefore independent of absolute duration. These considerations appeared to me incontestable, but I noticed that I had made no impression upon either the poet or my friend. My failure led me to infer that some powerful emotional factor was at work, which was disturbing their judgment. And I believed later that I had discovered what it was. What spoiled their enjoyment of beauty must have been a revolt in their minds against mourning. The idea that all this beauty was transient was giving these two sensitive minds a foretaste of mourning over its decease. And since the mind instinctively recoils against anything that is painful, they felt their enjoyment of beauty interfered with by thoughts of its transience. Mourning over the loss of something that we have loved or admired seems so natural to the layman that he regards it as self-evident. But to psychologists, mourning is a great riddle, one of those phenomena which cannot themselves be explained, but to which other obscurities can be traced back. We possess, as it seems, a certain amount of capacity for love, what we call libido, which is in the early stages of development directed towards our own ego. Later, though still at a very early time, this libido is diverted from the ego onto objects, which are thus in a sense taken into our ego. If the objects are destroyed or if they are lost to us, our capacity for love, our libido, is once more liberated, and it can then either take other objects instead or can temporarily return to the ego. But why it is that this detachment of libido from its object should be such a painful process is a mystery to us. And we have not hitherto been able to frame any hypothesis to account for it. We only see that libido clings to its objects and will not renounce those that are lost, even when a substitute lies ready to hand. Such then is mourning. My conversations with the poet took place in the summer before the war. A year later, the war broke out and robbed the world of its beauties. It destroyed not only the beauty of the countryside through which it passed and the works of art which it met with on its path, but it also shattered our pride in the achievements of our civilization, our admiration for many philosophers and artists, and our hopes for a final triumph over the differences between nations and races. It tarnished the lofty impartiality of our science. It revealed our instincts in all their nakedness and let loose the evil spirits within us, which we thought we had tamed forever by centuries of continuous education, by the noblest minds. It made our country small again, and made the rest of the world far remote. It robbed us of very much that we had loved, and showed us how ephemeral was much that we had regarded as immutable. We cannot be surprised that our libido, thus bereft of so many of its objects, has clung with all the greater intensity to what is left to us, that our love of our country, our affection for those nearest us, and our pride in what is common to us have suddenly grown stronger. But have those other possessions, which we have now lost, really ceased to have any worth for us because they have proved so perishable and so unresistant? To many of us this seems to be so, but once more wrongly, in my view. I believe that those who think thus and seem ready to make a permanent renunciation because what was precious has proved not to be lasting are simply in a state of mourning for what is lost. Mourning, as we know, however painful it may be, comes to a spontaneous end. When it has renounced everything that has been lost, then it has consumed itself and our libido is once more free, insofar as we are still young and active. To replace the lost objects by fresh ones equally or still more precious. It is to be hoped the same will be true of the losses caused by this war. When once the mourning is over, it will be found that our high opinion of the riches of civilization has lost nothing from our discovery of their fragility. We shall build up again all the war has destroyed, and perhaps on firmer ground and more lastingly than before. Okay. I wanted to just do a quick overview of Freud. Which we're not going to cover everything in detail, but let's just talk about some basic things. And keep in mind that Freud is historically specific. Meaning, we're going to get into this with Benjamin in subsequent readings, but Freud might himself, his view of psychology, might himself be a symptom of the capitalist era. So, Freud would use what he called topographical imagery or metaphors to explain his theory, which was not a theory of psychology, but it was a theory of therapy. Theory of therapy. So Freud was not trying to explain how the mind works. He's not a philosopher of mind. He's not a psychologist in the sense of being a psychological researcher. He's a psychotherapist. He's a clinician. So he's describing, his theory is describing how therapy works. So it starts with the neurosis. So he's known for two big discoveries. One is the sexual basis for neuroses. The other is the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious mental process. He actually considered the latter to be the more important discovery, and the former to be just one instantiation of the latter. So what that means is that really there's one mental process, but it's internally conflicted. So there's one mental process, it's internally conflicted, and because it's internally conflicted, one needs categories of describing the conflict. So the way of describing the conflict is, he found clinically appropriate, the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious, or the conflict between the ego and the id, which these terms don't actually occur in the German original. These Latin words are added to the English translation. So ego just means I, and id just means it. So it's between the I and the it. So if you go to a therapist and you say, why do I do that? You are speaking as a subject, you're the I, but you're also referring to yourself, you're also the object, you're the it. Right? So, the ego, thought of topographically, he has a few ways of describing it. One is the iceberg in the ocean. So the iceberg in the ocean, you only see the tip of the iceberg. The weight, the mass, the volume of the iceberg is below the waterline, you don't see it. So that was a way of describing the proportion of the conscious and the unconscious. So the vast preponderance of the mental process is unconscious rather than conscious. Another way of describing it would be a wave in the water also, which is you see the crest of the wave, you see the froth of the wave, but you don't see the mass of water moving under the surface that is actually causing the wave. Unicellular organism. That's one that we should keep in mind, and especially when we do Bergson. Bergson going to have his biologism. Unicellular organism defined by the cell membrane that mediates between inside and outside. So he described the ego as like the cell membrane of a unicellular organism. So it has to manage the pressure coming from inside and coming from outside. Do you remember your cellular biology from high school? Osmotic pressure, right? So you can kill a cell by having too many electrolytes in the element or too little electrolytes in the element. So it will either burst from within or be crushed from without based on the balance of electrolytes in the water and based on the cell membrane's ability to process electrolytes across its surface. So the ego is like that. It has to filter, like a cell membrane, it has to filter two opposing things, external stimuli and internal impulses. So the unconscious would be the internal impulses, and then external stimuli are those of reality. But we didn't have this membrane to begin with. So it's only in the course of psychological development that we develop this membrane, that we develop this capacity. When we start out, according to Freud, we have primary narcissism, and in some ways we don't even have primary narcissism. So because we're going to be talking about narcissism, let me pause on this one. Speaking of myth, the ancient myth of Narcissus. So when Freud uses the term narcissism, he's not using it in a colloquial sense, he's using it in a precise literary sense. So ancient myth of Narcissus. Narcissus was a beautiful boy who was completely oblivious to everything around him. And there was a forest nymph, Echo, who was a creature of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Anyway, she fell in love with Narcissus, but he paid no attention to her, and then she just faded to an echo of herself. And then Aphrodite, goddess of love, decided that she was going to punish Narcissus for doing this to Echo. And so the punishment was that he had to fall in love. So he was cursed to fall in love with the first thing that he saw, which turned out to be his own reflection in a pool. And then he fell into the pool and drowned. So narcissism means lack of external objects. So the purest narcissistic state is psychosis. That's when you're completely withdrawn and completely sort of indifferent and insensate to the external world. So we don't have that experience after birth, except in like a vegetative state, but even that would be not quite, because it wouldn't be a mental state. So it's sort of posited primary narcissism as like an originary state that never exists in a pure state. So our psychology begins as a function of being drawn out of that primary narcissistic state in relation to others. So the disturbance of our primary narcissism comes from others. It comes from primary caregivers. So first comes through feeding, and then it comes through toilet training, and then it comes through other kinds of things like banning masturbation. If you're getting too old, good little girls, good little boys don't play with themselves like that anymore. You have to stop doing that, stop playing with yourself. Which happens like age 3 or 4. 3, probably. And toilet training happens before that. So we're drawn out of our narcissism. We learn to deal with reality. We learn to deal with our own internal impulses. We learn to regulate our own hunger, our own excretory functions, and our own sexual pleasure, genital pleasure. And our psychology is characterized by the development of how we deal with those things. Okay. So in doing so, we have to build up our defense against both our internal impulses and external stimuli such that they don't overwhelm us. So the idea is that we develop our ego insofar as we're not overwhelmed by either external stimuli or internal impulses. However, our earliest interaction with others leaves a kind of residue or leaves a kind of artifact in our psyche, and that's a breach in the ego. That speaks back to our originary narcissistic state, and in which the first way that we had for relating to others was by identifying with them and imitating them. So internalizing them, and that he calls that the superego or the over-I, the over-I. And the over-I confuses and identifies internal and external. So a way of demonstrating this is the baby hungry because it sees the mother's breast, or is just hungry, and then the mother's breast appears, and then it's satisfied. Right? And it also is complicated by the fact that biologically, women who are in lactation will spontaneously lactate at the cry of a baby. Right? So it's kind of like the mother responds to the baby responds to the mother. So the idea is that there's this kind of identification and a lack of distinction between what's an internal impulse and what's an external stimulus. And that's developed in the form of an internalization of parental authority, basically. Like that you seek satisfaction from your parent, you seek approval from your parent, you seek pleasure from your parent, and that's understood as being on condition that you do what the parent wants, and then you internalize that, and that's the over-I, or the superego. By the way, he understood the conflict between conscious and unconscious. He later modified that it wasn't simply a conflict between ego and id, but it was actually a conflict between ego and superego. Okay. So he describes it also as a conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, meaning what your libidinal desire is and the reality that it encounters that might contradict it. But really, the ego has to satisfy the pleasure principle in reality. So again, pleasure principle and reality principle are not actually two things. When we're functioning, when we're acting, thinking, feeling, because that's what psychology is, it's all these things, when we're remembering things, we are satisfying the pleasure principle. So I am satisfying my pleasure principle by working in the way that I do, lecturing about philosophy and convening a class or whatever. So you could not do anything that you do unless it satisfies the pleasure principle, including self-destructive things. Including self-destructive things. The only reason why we do self-destructive things is because they satisfy the pleasure principle, even though they might hurt us.
Isn't he also like, you can never actually be satisfied because there's always something more that you want, right? It's like,
Well, it's insatiable in the sense that we're constantly doing it, yes. It's an activity. Right? That's why it's a mental process. I guess I should also have put mental activity. Right? Meaning, it's insofar as we're alive, we have to continually do this. So that's why it's important to understand that it's not like ego and id exists or superego exists. These things don't exist as separate things. It's not like the hippocampus versus the cerebellum or something like that. It's not. It's one mental process. And of course, even the way the brain works, all the parts of your brain are functioning together. It's not like one thing is functioning and another thing is functioning. It's all one thing. Right. So, narcissism. Okay, so ambivalence. This came up. So the idea is that there are three phases of psychological development that are associated with sexual development as well. So the first is the primary narcissism, the originary narcissism, and that's a monadic state. That's a word that's going to come back again, so keep that in mind, monad, the monad. Then the first development is a dyadic development. That's when we're developing our capacities in relation to the other. So that would be self and other. You could say subject and object. Child and parent. It's the primary caregiver in the child, whether that's the biological mother or someone else, it doesn't matter. It's a relationship of projection and identification. So it's a relationship of internalization, introjection, and projection. So the other is seen in terms of the self, and the self is seen in terms of the other. And he calls that a homosexual relationship because it's based on sameness. It's based on imitating and identifying with the other and projecting onto the other. Whereas the original condition is asexual. So primary narcissism is asexual. Sex just means combining of things. That's the Latin word. Right? So homosexual, sameness. The triadic relationship is the Oedipus complex, or the Oedipal phase of development. And that's when the relationship between the child and the primary caregiver is interrupted by the presence of another figure. And that is a traumatic thing that the child has to learn to deal with. And the way the child learns to deal with that is actually separating themselves from the other and establishing their own independence. And also establishing the independence of the other. So with the dyadic relationship, it's a relationship of dependence, in which the other only exists in relation to the self, and the self only exists in relation to the other. He thinks with the Oedipal phase, we develop a sense of our independence and the independence of the other through having to accept the fact that the other has a relationship with another, independently of the relationship to you. So that's why it's self, other, another, which usually means child, mother, and father, right? So the mother has a relationship with the father independently from the child, and that's a trauma. But this allows for the development of not an authority relation, but of a self-identity. Like, again, the independence of the ego and therefore an actual separation of subject and object. And the original identification splits between two different kinds of others: ego ideals and object ideals. Right, so love on the basis of wanting to be like someone, and love on the basis of wanting to have someone. So an ego ideal and an object ideal. He thinks that neurosis is regressive in the sense that it overwhelms our capacities developed in the Oedipal phase and drives us back into earlier ways of dealing with things. So it drives us back from a triadic to a dyadic relationship, and therefore it's the eruption of this ambivalence. And ambivalence doesn't mean neutral or lukewarm or wishy-washy. Ambivalence means very diametrically opposed, strong feelings of opposite character. So love and hate, desire and fear, attraction and repulsion, enjoyment and disgust, sadism and masochism. There's admiration and contempt. There are all sorts of ways this plays out. Why? Because this is the feeling that we had towards the other with the primary caregiver. And because all these feelings are actually defenses. So we defend ourselves against our mothers by loving and hating them, by desiring and fearing them, by being attracted and repulsed by them, by enjoying them and being disgusted by them. Right? And it's a sadomasochistic relationship. Freud was the one who linked sadism and masochism. Before Freud, sadism and masochism were understood as completely different things. With Freud, they become two sides of the same coin. Meaning masochism is just a self-sadism, and sadism is just a projected masochism. Right, so you project your own suffering onto another, that's sadism. That's this idea. Right, you make the other suffer because it's actually your own masochism you're playing out.
This might be a slight digression, but I'm interested in put Kant kind of a conversation with Freud. You said in the lecture that for Kant, his analytical terms are just that, they're analytical, they're not phenomenal. So like understanding, judgment, reason.
They are phenomenal. They're the way things appear.
But they're analytical categories.
Right.
Primarily.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like I have a part of my brain
That's right.
Like, and I think
They're not actually separate, that's right.
Reading Freud, does he consider his terms he's working with, id, ego, superego, as phenomenally real or as analytical terms?
Well, they're manifest,
Yeah.
and therefore they are analytical. Right, in other words, you analyze it because that's the way it appears.
But there's like a metaphysic implied by it, like a id
Excuse me.
in my brain that is, kept in check. Like how
Well, there's an internal struggle. So again, there's one mental process that, the way I like to describe it is this. Okay, so you have an internal combustion engine. You have pistons firing, so not an e-vehicle, but an old gas guzzler. And it just hums, it purrs, unless there's a misfire. And then suddenly you are aware of the fact that there are pistons. Right? So there might be some substantial difference within the psyche that would basically correspond to different experiences one had as a child. So the way he understands it, it's the conservatism of the psyche. No prior psychical state is ever fully left behind. Meaning, even though we develop and we mature, there's part of us that's still in that primary narcissistic state. And there's part of us that's still in that dyadic ambivalence. And indeed, all prior psychical states have to be satisfied by later psychological development. So the triadic development, where we have a developed ego, where we distinguish between self and other, that still has to satisfy our primary narcissism. Right? So in other words, there is part of us that never quite unconsciously, never quite believes that there's anything else but us. That we are the universe and the universe is us. Right? But if we act that way, it's not going to really be good. It's not going to work. very pragmatic. Freud's very pragmatic. And then really, even though there are these different things going on in terms of our experience, nonetheless, it all does act together. Like we are actually doing it, right? So, it's not like, again, it's not like the sense state of perception. It's not like we're actually fragmented. That if we experience fragmentation, what we're really experiencing is internal conflict, according to Freud. And internal conflict means that these aren't just jumbled together different things, but there's some intrinsic relation among those things. Right?
Wait, excuse me.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a question too.
Uh-huh.
When reading Freud, I'm never entirely sure if he's more on the Kantian or the Hegelian side, because I feel he's like somewhere in between, right?
Yep,
So
yep.
Because he's trying to find like analytical categories found through experience, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Mhm.
what you were just explaining.
Mhm.
But then he builds this entire dialectic of polarized concepts, right? And that's extremely Hegelian. And actually, he's like doing like the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, like the
Mhm.
whole time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
So Eros Thanatos, Sex and Death.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
So where exactly would you put or would you like consider Freud to be?
Okay, so this is going to be the frustrating thing in terms of how I understand these things. And also what I think, like Benjamin and Marxism, that I wouldn't draw a hard line between Kant and Hegel. I would say Kant is dialectical. He's not just antinomical, and it's not just Hegel that's dialectical, and also Hegel is antinomical as well, meaning it's not like, I teach Kant, I'm teaching the Critique of Judgment now, and it's like page 1, dialectic, right? So it's, now the question is, how do we understand the relationship of the categories, how we understand the kind of analytical distinctions? So it's sort of a parallel question, I feel, which is how much substance do we give the analytical distinctions? So one way of thinking about it is contradiction. And I guess Freud would appear to be more Hegelian in the sense that contradiction is not overcome, but is like constitutive, right? So it's not like, okay, we have these analytical antinomies that we resolve. Kant. Whereas with Hegel, it's more like, no, actually, it's in the contradiction. Now, the interesting thing is that Hegel can be read multiple ways, right? In other words, Hegel could be read as resolving the contradiction or as preserving the contradiction. And when we read Nietzsche later in the semester, we're going to find Nietzsche arguing against Hegel, but really, and he's very explicit, he's arguing against the sort of Christian Hegelians and the right-wing Hegelians, because they get rid of the contradiction in contradiction. And he's like, no, we have to keep the contradiction in contradiction, otherwise there is no contradiction. So if we just philosophize contradiction in order to resolve it and smooth it out, then we're actually losing contradiction. Right? So that's really the question. The question is, what's the status of the contradiction? Now, what I'd say about Freud, and the way we tend to read Freud, and that includes me, my education is also the same as probably you guys. I read Lacan before I read Freud. Lacan is not Freud. He's not Freud. Why? Because Lacan is about the impossibility of the ego functioning with the reality principle. Freud is about the possibility. So it's kind of opposite, which is that it's kind of like how this doesn't work versus how it works. And again, we could read Hegel that way. How is this not working? How is this working? And again, Freud is going to appear paradoxical because on the one hand, he's not normative. He's not normative. He's not normative, even though he tends to be misread that way. He is, all of his categories are categories of pathology. And therefore, it's not normative, it is descriptive. In other words, he's saying this is the way it is. He's not saying this is the way it should be. And yet, we still are able to do things. And he did believe in curing neuroses. He had the experience of curing neuroses, in fact. So, especially with the narcissistic things, like mourning and melancholia, what we have is like a limit case, meaning it's like the limit of psychoanalysis to have a therapeutic effect. And so that's the question. The question is it about limits or is it about capacities? And Freud was really trying to describe capacities. In other words, he was describing, it's a theory of therapy. How can neuroses be overcome? Because they can. Like he thought they can. Right? He treated people for 6 months, a year and a half, boom, done, cured. Right? Not like going to a therapist for 20 years. No. So, which Freud called analysis terminable and interminable. Right? He has an essay on it. So, in this respect, does one ever get rid of the contradiction? No. Get rid of, but no. But overcome, yes. In the sense of a neurosis can be overcome. But then it can be replaced by another neurosis, or another neurosis could develop later, right? So it's not like permanent. Like you can be functional and then become dysfunctional, and then become functional again, and then become dysfunctional again. So it has to do with how we understand contradiction. And the contradiction in the sense of something that's constitutive, meaning it makes things what they are, versus something that's more dysfunctional and destroying the thing. Right? The constructive principle of contradiction, a destructive principle of contradiction. I would say that's the paradox that we have to deal with because, and the reason for this, capitalism, is because bourgeois society, like Kant, is really considering the dialectic to be like constitutive, productive, constructive, meaning the dialectic is what makes things work. Whereas Marx is describing a contradiction in capitalism where the dialectic is describing how it doesn't work, how it fails to work, how it destroys itself. Right? So, you see, the dialectic has this kind of inherently ambivalent character, which is that it can either describe how things work. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, of course, Lenin said one always needs more dialectics. Adorno put it, as Benjamin's student, as you need a dialectic of the dialectic. Right. So if Marxism is just telling you how everything works out, then it's just a just-so story. And, that would be tantamount to thinking that we've overcome the contradiction. But we haven't overcome the contradiction. Right? So the difference between Freud and Lacan is that Lacan is like making us face the contradiction, whereas Freud is not just doing that, but also about overcoming it. Right, so the character of the psychological contradiction is different. And again, Freud's different. He's not a philosopher. It's not like Kant and Hegel because, of course, his concern is different. Meaning, everyone is more or less neurotic. Meaning, everyone has more or less contradictory psychology. And yet, it usually doesn't get in the way. When it gets in the way, we call it neurotic. And when it really gets in the way, we call it psychotic. So, by the way, these terms, neurosis is just inflammation of the nerves. That's what neurosis means. It means you're like overly sensitive, right? You're like a raw nerve. Psychosis means an inflammation of the psyche. It's like an exaggerated psyche that bursts all bounds, inner and outer distinctions are lost. You were going to say?
No, it's just like a small follow-up. Is maybe Freud theorizing like in the realm of metaphysics in a way, because after when people read Marx through Freud or Freud through Marx, they like ground it on materialism, which is very clear how capitalism creates the dynamics for neurosis and psychosis in modern society. Right. But then Freud was not himself yet a Marxist, right?
No.
Like his theory was not Marxist in nature, materialist in nature. Right. So maybe the reading before materialists, Freud was maybe theorizing on metaphysics too.
Sure.
Because these things are not anchored in biology. And he's very explicit with that, because people always criticize him that he's not doing science, but then and he's very explicit with how he's randomized controlled trials and his studies are not always consistent because he doesn't have the...
It's case by case.
Exactly. So for example, in Totem and Taboo, he explains that very clearly. He's like, I'm being very descriptive, as you say. So
Descriptive,
he's not being
yeah.
normative.
That's right.
In the way that like every single pre-modern civilization will behave this way, but I'm analyzing this particular way.
That's right.
But that's why I believe it's almost touching the realm of metaphysics.
I would say that it's frankly metaphysical. I mean, in
Okay.
some ways, you know, again, when we do Bergson next time,
Yeah.
it's not accidental, that's what Marxists would say, that Bergson's philosophy, which was the most popular philosophy in the world at the time, is contemporaneous with Freud. Right, because there is this kind of vitalistic kind of view of not only human beings, and not even organic life, but of the universe itself.
Yeah.
Right, and so he did, like the Eros and Thanatos, you know, I use this chart when I'm teaching just Freud, so not just touching on Freud like we are here, but when I'm really getting into it. And so beyond the pleasure principle, I mean, he has a whole, like, kind of speculation about, like, matter itself and its properties, right? And so the idea that, like, because we are material beings, we have a kind of drive to return to an inanimate state, right? Because, you know, we began as inanimate matter and will return to inanimate matter, you know, dust to dust, right? And that is a metaphysics. That's frankly a metaphysics.
Yeah.
But if we always keep in mind, but why is Freud writing at all? Like, what is the point? He's not a philosopher. His point is that this helps describe psychodynamics, and that's the only purpose of it. Right. So when he gets metapsychological, like in the reading we did for today, or he gets like very speculative, he's frankly metaphysical, and he's not concerned because the metaphysics is only meant to be descriptive. It's not meant to be like, it's supposed to be psychologically descriptive.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be psychologically phenomenal, meaning why do we sometimes appear to return to a vegetative state psychologically? Experientially, what is that? What's the pleasure in that? What's the psychological satisfaction in letting go of all attachment? Right? So it will sound like metaphysical assertions about reality, everything. But it's really psychological. Okay. Okay. So that's, go ahead. Yes.
Go through this very quickly.
Sprint.
What?
Sprint.
Refer to the finish, yeah.
How are we? Oh, yeah. Definitely. Oh, the clock is not even, oh, no, it's just exactly accurate. Okay.
So also in addition, so we discussed, I don't know if you want to bring up like Sasha's, Benjamin's model of like Benjamin's philosophy, but
You mean the subject-object?
yeah. So like the quote is, "This experience then also includes religion as a true experience. Neither God nor man or subject." Is that on one of these things?
Yeah, it should be
Yeah,
on
maybe
the
let's
next
go to the
slide.
next one. This is still Sasha.
Oh, it is?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that's
that's,
fine.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
so we were discussing also as part of that reading how Benjamin also said that religion has to be part of like the philosophy of experience, but also that religion was an experience of like true experience without object or subject, which is an interesting. It's just an interesting concept. And then we had kind of been like, well, how would we like put religion into the model that we drew of like subject to object, then to true knowledge, which is nature, or nature, and nature equals like the experience within pure knowledge, and kind of like how religion would fit in for him into like the model.
Can I say something because you have entities and because it sort of came up? Like, in other
Yeah.
words, how should we deal with these things?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a difference to observe between entity and identity. So entity is just what exists, right? So it's like, I don't know, the thing. Whereas if something has identity, then it's an object. It's not a thing, it's an object. Right, if it has self-identity. Right, so we haven't done this, we'll have to come back around to it because of lack of time. Entity refers to being, identity refers to becoming. In other words, something becomes identical to itself. It isn't merely identical to itself, it merely exists. So in this respect, metaphysics would be more categories of identity than of entity. In Kant, right? Another way of putting it would be in terms of like human beings. There's what I am, and then there's who I am. So what I am is my entity, who I am is my identity. Ralph Ellison, African-American writer, wonderful essay in Shadow and Act, I think, collection of essays. He talks about the problem with racism is that it confuses entity and identity, meaning blackness is not a category of entity, it's a category of identity. And yet racism is precisely attributing it to entity. It's not entity, it's identity. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, so anyway, that kind of differed from discussions on Kant also, as his inclusion of religion into sheer experience. But then as he got into like Berlin, he like basically does huge swaths of his childhood without any kind of religious experiences whatsoever. And he was raised Jewish, and there's like some kind of like notations about like where he, went to some religious event, but he didn't. So we just thought that was really interesting that he put in this whole bit about having how religions were like this really important element to experience, but then when he's like identifying his own experiences, he really didn't mention any. And then
so Sholem was invoked, Gershom Sholem or Gerhard Sholem. Gerhard's the German name, Gershom is the Hebrew name. So Sholem was asked after Benjamin's death. He said, was Benjamin a Marxist or was he a Jewish mystic? And he said he was a Marxist.
Yeah.
He said he was not a Jewish mystic at all. He was a Marxist. Meaning he uses categories of Jewish mysticism descriptively, but the critical categories are Marxist.
But why did he put in here that like religion is like the only true experience without subject-object? If he had no experience of that.
Okay, so he's kind of paradoxical about that, isn't he, in terms of his personal experience. But let's because we're dealing with Nietzsche and Kant and Freud. So Freud is like the radical atheist, right? There's like a bad movie, Freud's Last Session or something. It's when he is like approached by some British author and they're trying to have a debate about the existence of God. And Freud is like dying of like throat cancer or something, and so he's just like, fuck you, there's no God. Where is it C.S. Lewis? Who's the author? Anyway, it's a little bit of it's not a real, it's like a dramatic encounter that probably never took place. And then it's also about Anna Freud being lesbian, which may or may not have been true, right? And how he's like, Freud likes gay men but doesn't like lesbians, and the reason he doesn't like lesbians is that he hates the fact that his daughter is a lesbian. And so it's about that whole dynamic. But anyway, Freud's Last Session. It's not a great movie, I'm sorry to say. I wish it were better, but it's not. But God. Okay, so Freud's a radical atheist, supposedly. Fine, okay. Benjamin's an atheist too. Fine. However, that's not really the issue. The issue is, what's the rational object of the concept of God? In other words, to say God exists or God doesn't exist, both of those are theological statements. Right, so the question is, what do we make of all this? Especially because Kant and Hegel were regarded by their contemporaries as radical atheist, anti-Christian, anti-religion thinkers. They themselves were like, yeah, right? So what they are is post-religious thinkers, post-theological thinkers, post-metaphysical thinkers, post-metaphysical thinking. So why is that? Because in a way, religion's the first thing that humans have that the animals don't have. And everything after that is just an outgrowth of religion. Everything that we do is religion. This is going to be a theme in this course. Everything we do is religion. Morality is religion, science is religion, philosophy is religion. It's all religion. Meaning it's differentiated, elaborated religion. So the big difference is human cultures, social forms, aim to perpetuate themselves, aim to preserve themselves. We live in a revolutionary society. All that is solid melts into air, right? Objectively, we're in a dynamic of a revolutionary society. So we're transcending religion in a new and different way. New and different than Socrates and Plato and Aristotle did. Right? Aristotle, who told Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great is like, I'm going to go out and find the gods. They're in India. And he's like, only common people believe such things. You got to get real. You're a king now. You're in a serious position of responsibility. You can't believe this nonsense. Aristotle, right? So we do understand like that philosophy is not theology because it loses its grounding, and then we have to be careful about projecting our own modern sensibility back onto that, but there's something to it. And by the way, all classical civilizations had this moment in which philosophy emerges from theology. So Confucius, like, there's just it happens. It's the axial age, this happens. And science also seems to differentiate itself from both religion and philosophy, in fact. So this happens. Yet, at a certain level, it's all still based on that first thing. It's all still an elaboration of that first thing. And it is at the metaphysical level of assertions about reality and assertions about ourselves. Because theology was concerned about reality and about ourselves. It was about our inner and outer reality. So it's all religion. If we haven't transcended religion, maybe we will never transcend religion. But that doesn't mean it's religion in the old way. And what we were talking about earlier about enlightenment and myth, right? That religion was the first form of enlightenment. We could say theology, that we started with religious morality, and then we developed a way of thinking about it, theology, which was our first enlightenment. And then we've gone through many revolutions in that enlightenment, in which the prior form of enlightenment we now regard as myth. And that includes the anti-metaphysical strain of bourgeois enlightenment. Whether it's like Francis Bacon or David Hume, right? There are varieties of this, of like anti-metaphysics, because metaphysics is seen as still theological. Kant came along and said, but we can't actually do without metaphysics. That as soon as we think something, it's a metaphysical phenomenon. Okay, so that's really the issue. Similarly, you could say, therefore, everything's theological. And so, I think we'd mentioned this last time. All literature is still the Bible, right? So, you pick up Kafka, you are reading the Talmud, in fact, right? Because there's continuity there. That in fact, language itself speaks with the voice of God, even though it's not the voice of God. So I love getting into arguments with my husband about Islam, because he's Muslim, and the Quran, because he says the Quran really is the word of God, but the Talmud and the Gospels are not, because they were altered by people, and they have too much human interpretation, whereas Muhammad, faithfully transcribed the Archangel Gabriel's whatever, and I'm like, but wait, first of all, it's Arabic. Second of all, he didn't even hear it from God, he heard it from the Archangel Gabriel. Right, so it's like there's telephone involved, right?
They're like an opposite end, so it seems like, but I guess not if everything's religion.
Everything's religion, and so he's a true believer. So I was talking to him about socialism the other day, and he's like, "Well, if we do capitalism according to Sharia, then it would be fine." And I'm like, actually, a lot of socialists think that. especially nowadays, right? Because of everything that's going on, then Islam has to be kind of propped up in an anti-imperialist way. But also there are Christian socialists, and there are Jewish socialists who are like, if only we have the tikkun concept, that would give us the right socialism, yeah? Anyway, so ideology. Why is everything still religion? Because everything's still ideology. Everything's still ideology. Right. Which doesn't mean that we'll ever get over ideology, but we might get over this ideology.
And continue.
Yeah, and create a new ideology, which then people in the future will have to overcome. Right? Although overcoming this ideology will be a pretty big deal. Will be a pretty big deal. Right? So we can worry. I'm watching the Foundation series, the TV series based on the Isaac Asimov. And, it's a little bit cheesy. I feel like Asimov, like, it's some kind of like Asimov versus Frank Herbert, like Dune versus Foundation. Like whether it's real, like whether religion is real or whether it's like this concocted thing, right? Like the Foundation is like concocted by the mathematician who has figured out like the future and then has to create a religion to like make things happen or whatever. Has to create like a cult to like separate and do their own thing. And so, yeah, but nonetheless, that doesn't invalidate the critique of religion, which is what Marx called the beginning of critique. All critique begins with the critique of religion. All enlightenment begins with enlightenment about religion, including religious enlightenment about religion, namely theology. All right, sorry we went a little bit late. So, okay, we are a little bit behind Berlin Chronicle. Let's come back to the Berlin Chronicle. Also, we just didn't, I don't know if we quite hit it with melancholia. We did not. We kind of did it around the edges.
There's a little more in like the presentation too, but it's like...
It's going to be important because it already came up a little bit. Like, is Benjamin a maniac or a melancholic?
Well,
I mean, there's also Nietzsche.
But we were also saying like just the time frames of each thing. It was like 1913, 1918, and 1938. And he's different in different play times. And then
He develops his ideas, that's right.
yeah, and then also just as a society during World War I, you could say that was kind of like, melancholic and, and then after the war there's mania with the Industrial Revolution, etc.
Here's the tricky thing. So Benjamin is not a melancholic. Nietzsche was not a melancholic. However, Benjamin might have been a theorist of melancholia, and Nietzsche might have been a philosopher of melancholia. In the same way that Nietzsche was not a nihilist, but he was a philosopher of nihilism.
His nostalgia in Berlin seems sometimes like melancholia, or maybe just mourning.
I
Actually,
feel like I read Berlin
Mourning.
as kind of like identifying this like melancholia of the experience of modernity.
Yeah.
That like this thing has been lost and culturally there is nothing new for our libido to attach to.
So here's
all
the
in
tricky
this
bit.
melancholia.
The tricky bit is that capitalism might be a melancholic society.
Shit.
Because there is always an object to attach. Yeah.
Because of the derealization of things, right? All that is solid melts into air. So this might be a manic and depressive society. It might be a bipolar society. And especially in the 20th century, meaning what was a limiting or a threshold phenomenon for Freud might just become our endemic reality. And that's why we don't suffer from ordinary neuroses anymore. We suffer from
Really
anxiety
huge
and
ones.
depression.
Yeah.
No, anxiety and depression. We suffer from more narcissistic things.
What's
Because
the plan for the next lesson?
Proust, did I get volunteers? No, I did not. Oh, yes, I did. Excellent. So next time we will do Image of Proust. We'll get into a little bit of Bergson, but we'll catch up. We'll catch up on the Berlin Chronicle,
Okay.
especially. And try to fold that Freud back into the Berlin Chronicle.
Thank you.
Faculty members do study.